A beggar hunger alien girl offers her body as reward for food, then humans help her for food. Varen shivered as the cold wind swept through the empty streets. Her thin, tattered cloak did little to shield her from the biting chill, and the once glimmering hues of her alien skin now appeared dull and lifeless. Each step felt heavier than the last, as hunger gnawed at her insides. She hadn't eaten in days. Her legs trembled with every movement, threatening to give way, but she forced herself to keep walking. The human city was overwhelming, its towering buildings and ceaseless noise, so different from the serene landscapes of her home planet. Here, no one looked at her with kindness. Those who noticed her either averted their gaze or stared with a mixture of fear and disgust. She had quickly learned that she was an outsider in every sense of the word. The scent of freshly baked bread drifted from a small bakery ahead, its warm glow spilling onto the street through fogged-up windows. Varen's stomach churned violently at the smell, and she instinctively moved closer. Pressing her face to the glass, she gazed longingly at the golden loaves stacked neatly on the shelves. Her hands trembled as she imagined holding one, feeling its warmth seep into her palms. But she knew it was impossible. The baker had already shooed her away twice when she'd lingered too long outside. The look of disdain on his face had made her chest tighten, a sharp reminder that she didn't belong here. Varen stepped back, her silver eyes brimming with unshed tears. She turned away from the bakery and stumbled toward the shadowy safety of an alley. The sounds of the bustling city faded as she sank to the ground, her back pressed against the cold, rough brick wall. She pulled her knees to her chest, trying to ignore the growing ache in her stomach. The night deepened and the temperature dropped further. Varen huddled in her cloak, though it offered little comfort. Her mind wandered back to her home, to the fields of soft, glowing moss and the gentle hum of life that surrounded her people. She had been someone there, a person with a name, a family, and a future. Now she was nothing but a beggar on a foreign world, fighting to survive each day. As the hours dragged on, a desperate thought began to form in her mind. She hated it, hated herself for even considering it, but the hunger was unrelenting. Her body was weak, and her resolve was crumbling. On her planet, one's body was sacred, a vessel of dignity and pride. But here, dignity seemed like a luxury she could no longer afford. Varen clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as tears spilled down her cheeks. Could she truly offer herself for food? The thought filled her with shame, but she couldn't deny the raw, primal need that clawed at her. If she didn't eat soon, she wouldn't survive much longer. Her trembling intensified as she made her decision. She would try, just once. If it meant she could silence the painful growling in her stomach, she would endure the humiliation. She wiped her face and forced herself to stand. Her legs wobbled beneath her as she stepped out of the alley, scanning the street for someone who might take pity on her. It was late, and most of the shops had closed, leaving the streets sparsely populated. That's when she saw him. A man was walking briskly down the sidewalk, his long coat flapping in the wind. His face was partially hidden beneath the brim of a worn hat, but there was something steady about his presence. He wasn't like the others who passed by her without a second glance. Summoning what little courage she had left, Varen stepped into his path. Her heart pounded in her chest as she raised her hands in a gesture of supplication. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracked and hoarse, "I'm hungry." The man stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing as he took in her appearance. He said nothing at first, his gaze lingering on her gaunt face and hollow eyes. Varen's cheeks burned under his scrutiny, and she lowered her head, ashamed of what she was about to say. I can give you something in return," she continued, her voice barely audible. "Anything you want, just please help me." For a moment there was only silence. Varen braced herself for rejection, for disgust, for the man to walk away without a word, but instead he spoke. "You don't need to offer me anything," he said softly. Varen's head snapped up in surprise. The man's expression had softened, and there was a kindness in his eyes that she hadn't seen in a long time. He shrugged off his coat and draped it over her shoulders, the sudden warmth making her shiver. "Come on," he said. "Let's get you something to eat." The man, whose name she later learned was Heron, led her to a small diner tucked away on a quiet street. The warmth inside was a stark contrast to the freezing night, and the rich aroma of food made Varen's knees weak. She clutched the coat tightly around her, feeling both out of place and overwhelmed. Heron guided her to a booth and gestured for her to sit. A waitress approached, eyeing Veyrin curiously but saying nothing as Heron ordered a full meal for her, soup, bread, and a plate of steaming vegetables. When the food arrived, Veyrin stared at it, her hands trembling. It had been so long since she'd seen such a bounty, her vision blurred with tears as she hesitated, unsure if this was real or some cruel trick. "Go ahead," Heron encouraged gently. "It's yours." Her first bite was small, tentative, but as the flavors burst on her tongue, she couldn't stop. She ate ravenously, tears streaming down her face as she devoured the meal. Heron watched in silence, his expression unreadable. When she finally finished, Veyrin leaned back in the booth, her body trembling from the sheer relief of being full. She wiped her eyes, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "You're welcome," Heron replied. "Do you have a place to stay?" Veyrin shook her head, her gaze dropping to the table. "Then come. With me," he said simply. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Why would you help me?" Heron shrugged, his tone matter-of-fact. "Because you need it, and because no one deserves to be left out in the cold." As they walked to Heron's modest apartment, Veyrin felt a strange mixture of gratitude and fear. She didn't know this man or why he was helping her, but his kindness had sparked something in her that she thought she'd lost. Hope. Heron's home was small but warm, with mismatched furniture and a faint scent of wood smoke. He offered her a spare blanket and gestured toward the worn couch in the living room. "It's not much, but it's better than the streets," he said. Veyrin clutched the blanket tightly, her chest tightening with emotion. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to," Heron replied, his tone gentle but firm. That night, as Veyrin lay on the couch, the warmth of the blanket wrapped around her, she allowed herself to dream for the first time in years. Maybe, just maybe, she could find a place in this world after all. And, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she slept without the ache of hunger gnawing at her. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, painting warm patterns on the walls of the modest living room. Veyrin stirred under the blanket, momentarily disoriented. The couch beneath her was softer than anything she'd slept on in years, and for a fleeting moment she thought she was back on her home planet. But the hum of distant traffic and the faint clatter of dishes in the kitchen reminded her of where she was. She sat up slowly, her muscles aching less now that they were no longer weighed down by hunger. The events of the previous night rushed back to her, and a lump formed in her throat. Heron, the man who had shown her kindness when no one else would, had given her something she thought impossible, a chance to feel human again. As if on cue, Heron appeared in the doorway, a steaming mug in his hand. He offered her a small smile, his tired eyes crinkling at the corners. "Good morning," he said, holding out the mug. "It's tea. Hope that's okay." Veyrin hesitated, her fingers brushing against his as she accepted the cup. The warmth seeped into her palms, grounding her. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice still raspy from disuse. Heron pulled a chair from the small dining table and sat across from her, studying her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Better," she replied, though the word felt inadequate to describe the absence of the gnawing emptiness that had haunted her for so long. She sipped the tea, its earthy flavor unfamiliar but comforting. Heron leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "I don't mean to pry, but how did you end up here? You're not from around here, that much is obvious." Veyrin froze, her grip tightening on the mug. She'd spent so long hiding her origins, fearing the consequences if anyone knew the truth. But Heron had shown her nothing but kindness. Could she trust him with her story? She faltered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was exiled. My people, they cast me out." Heron's brow furrowed, but he said nothing, waiting patiently for her to continue. Veyrin took a deep breath, the words spilling out in a rush. "My planet was dying. Resources were scarce, and our leaders decided that some of us weren't worth saving. They sent us away, hoping we'd survive elsewhere." Her voice broke, and she looked away, ashamed of the tears welling in her eyes. "I was one of the expendable ones. I thought I could make a life here, but I didn't know how hard it would be." Heron's jaw tightened, a flicker of anger crossing his face. "That's cruel, to abandon your own people like that." "It's how they've always been," Veyrin said bitterly. "Survival of the fittest. I wasn't strong enough, so I was cast aside." For a moment the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then Heron leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. "You're wrong about one thing," he said. "It's not about strength. It's about circumstances. You were dealt a bad hand, but that doesn't mean you're weak." Varen blinked, his words sinking in slowly. No one had ever spoken to her like that before. On her planet, weakness was a death sentence, a flaw to be exploited. But here, this man saw her as something more. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You don't even know me." Heron shrugged, his expression softening. "Because I've been there. Not in the same way, but I know what it's like to feel lost, to have nothing and no one. Someone helped me once when I needed it the most. I'm just paying it forward." Varen studied him, her silver eyes searching, his face for any sign of deceit. But all she saw was sincerity, a quiet strength born from his own struggles. "I don't know how to repay you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to," Heron replied with a small smile. "Just focus on getting back on your feet." Over the next few days, Heron's apartment became a refuge for Varen. He showed her how to navigate the city, pointing out places where she could find resources or seek help. He even lent her some of his clothes, which hung loosely on her slender frame, but offered more warmth than her tattered cloak. In return, Varen did her best to contribute. She cleaned the apartment, her nimble fingers making quick work of the dust and clutter. She also tried her hand at cooking, though her first few attempts were met with polite but strained smiles from Heron. "You're trying," he said with a chuckle, after one particularly charred meal. "That's what counts." Despite the light-hearted moments, Varen couldn't shake the weight of her situation. She knew she couldn't stay with Heron forever, no matter how kind he was. She needed to find a way to stand on her own, to prove to herself that she was more than just a burden. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Varen broached the subject. "I've been thinking," she began hesitantly. "I need to find work, something that will let me earn enough to survive." Heron nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's a good idea, but it won't be easy. People here, they're not always welcoming to outsiders." "I've noticed," Varen said dryly, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Heron chuckled. "I might know someone who can help. There's a shelter downtown that connects people with job opportunities. It's run by a friend of mine. She's persistent, but she means well." "Persistent?" Varen echoed, raising an eyebrow. "You'll see what I mean," Heron said with a grin. The next morning, Heron escorted Varen to the shelter, a bustling hub of activity nestled between two aging buildings. Inside, the air was filled with the hum of conversation and the clatter of chairs. A woman approached them, her sharp eyes and firm handshake exuding an air of authority. "Heron," she said, her tone warm but brisk. "Who's this?" "This is Varen," Heron replied. "She's looking for work. Thought you might have some leads." The woman, who introduced herself as Laura, studied Varen intently. Despite her initial nerves, Varen met her gaze with quiet determination. "All right," Laura said after a moment. "Let's see what we can do." Over the next hour, Laura walked Varen through the process of applying for jobs, offering tips and advice along the way. She didn't sugarcoat the challenges Varen would face, but her straightforward approach was oddly reassuring. By the time they left the shelter, Varen felt a flicker of hope she hadn't experienced in years. The weeks that followed were a blur of new experiences and small victories. With Laura's help, Varen found a part-time job at a local diner, washing dishes in the kitchen. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a start. Each shift left her exhausted, but proud. The work was steady, the pay just enough to cover her basic needs. And while some of her co-workers were wary of her at first, she gradually earned their trust through her quiet determination and willingness to help. Heron continued to be a source of support, always ready with a listening ear or a word of encouragement. Though Varen insisted on paying him back for the food and clothes he'd given her, he waved her off with a laugh. "Just keep going," he said. "That's all the thanks I need." One night, as Varen walked home from the diner, she paused on a bridge, overlooking the city. The lights stretched out before her like a sea of stars, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to dream. She thought of her home planet, of the people who had cast her aside. They had seen her as weak, unworthy of survival. But here, in this strange and often unforgiving world, she was beginning to prove them wrong. Varen smiled to herself, a small but genuine smile that carried the promise of better days ahead. For the first time in a long time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, she could build a life worth living. Varen's days settled into a steady rhythm. Every morning she rose early, the quiet hum of the city her only companion, as she prepared for her shift at the diner. The small kitchen bustled with activity, the clatter of dishes and the sizzle of grease forming a cacophony that no longer overwhelmed her. Though her hands ached from scrubbing pots and her back protested from hours spent on her feet, she welcomed the fatigue. It was the kind of exhaustion that came with purpose, with belonging. Her co-workers had slowly warmed to her presence. It started with cautious nods of acknowledgement, then polite small talk. One by one they began to include her in their conversations, curious about the quiet woman with sharp silver eyes and an accent they couldn't place. Varen offered vague explanations about her past, careful to avoid questions that might lead to uncomfortable truths. One afternoon, as the kitchen quieted during the lull between lunch and dinner, a young server named Lynn brought her a cup of tea. "You've been working like a machine back here," Lynn said with a grin. "Take a break before you keel over." Varen accepted the tea with a nod of thanks, unsure how to respond. Lynn was one of the friendlier staff members, her easygoing nature a stark contrast to Varen's guarded demeanor. "Where are you from?" Lynn asked, leaning against the counter. Varen hesitated. "Far away," she said carefully. Lynn laughed. "That's what everyone says when they don't want to talk about it." "Fair enough. Just thought I'd ask." There was no malice in her tone, only curiosity, and Varen found herself relaxing ever so slightly. "I appreciate the tea," she said softly. Lynn waved her off with a smile. "Any time. Just don't forget to take care of yourself, okay?" As the weeks turned into months, Varen's life began to take shape. She found a tiny apartment in a run-down building not far from the diner. It was barely more than a room with a kitchenette and a bathroom, but it was hers. The first night she slept there, she lay awake for hours, staring at the cracked ceiling and marveling at the fact that she finally had a place to call her own. Heron remained a constant presence in her life, checking in on her regularly. He brought over groceries when he suspected she was running low, and occasionally convinced her to join him for dinner at his apartment. Their conversations were a strange mix of light-hearted banter and heavy truths, each of them slowly unraveling the other's past. One evening, as they sat across from each other at Heron's small kitchen table, he asked a question that had been on his mind for weeks. "Do you miss it?" "Miss what?" Varen asked. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Your home," he said. "Your planet." Varen set her fork down, her appetite suddenly gone. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not as much as I thought I would. There wasn't much for me there, not after I was exiled." Heron studied her, his expression unreadable. "Do you ever think about going back?" She shook her head. "There's nothing to go back to. Even if I could, I wouldn't be welcome. This is my home now." The words felt strange on her tongue, but as she spoke them, she realized they were true. This world, with all its challenges and hardships, had become her new reality. And while it wasn't easy, it was better than the alternative. One night, as Varen walked home from her shift, she noticed a figure huddled on a bench near the bridge. The air was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and refused to leave. The figure was wrapped in a tattered coat, their shoulders hunched against the wind. Something about the scene tugged at Varen's heart. She hesitated, her instincts urging her to keep walking, to avoid drawing attention to herself. But then she remembered the nights she'd spent in the same position, cold and alone, with no one to turn to. Taking a deep breath, she approached the bench. "Excuse me," she said softly. The figure looked up, revealing a young woman with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes. She couldn't have been more than 20, but the weariness in her gaze made her seem older. "Are you okay?" Varen asked. The woman shook her head, her voice barely audible. I don't have anywhere to go." Without thinking, Varen shrugged off her coat and draped it over the woman's shoulders. "This will help for now," she said, "but you can't stay." "Out here? There's a shelter a few blocks away. I can take you there." The woman stared at her in disbelief. "Why would you help me?" Varen smiled faintly. "Because someone helped me when I needed it." The walk to the shelter was slow, the woman's steps unsteady from exhaustion. Varen stayed by her side, offering quiet reassurances until they reached the building. A volunteer greeted them at the door, taking the woman inside and promising to find her a warm bed and a hot meal. As Varen turned to leave, the woman called out to her, "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Varen nodded, her chest tightening with a mix of sadness and satisfaction. She knew what it felt like to be saved, and now she'd had the chance to pass that kindness on to someone else. The encounter stayed with her, a reminder of how far she'd come and how much further she still had to go. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about making a life worth living. Varen began volunteering at the shelter on her days off, helping with meals and cleaning. The work was tiring but fulfilling, and she found herself drawn to the stories of the people she met. Each one was a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit, of the strength it took to keep going in the face of adversity. One day, as she scrubbed tables in the dining hall, Laura approached her with a clipboard. "You've been doing great work here," Laura said. "I was wondering if you'd be interested in something more permanent." Varen looked up, surprised. "What do you mean?" "We're looking for someone to help manage the kitchen," Laura explained. "It's not glamorous, but it's steady work, and you'd be making a real difference." The offer caught Varen off guard. She hadn't expected to find another opportunity so soon, let alone one that felt so meaningful. "I'll think about it," she said, her mind racing. "Take your time," Laura replied. "But not too much time. We could really use you." As Varen walked home that evening, her thoughts were a whirlwind of possibilities. She'd come so far from the desperate, starving woman who had stumbled into Heron's life. And now, for the first time, she felt like she was standing on solid ground, ready to build something lasting. She thought of Heron, of the shelter, of the people she'd met along the way. Each of them had played a part in her journey, helping her piece together the fragments of her broken life. And now it was her turn to do the same for others. By the time she reached her apartment, her mind was made up. She would accept Laura's offer. It was a chance to give back, to make a difference, and to prove to herself that she was capable of more than just surviving. As she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, a sense of peace washed over her. For the first time in years, she felt hopeful about the future, and she knew deep in her heart that she was exactly where she was meant to be. The city had changed in the months since Varen had first arrived, but so had she. Her steps were no longer hesitant, nor was she the same lonely woman she had been when she first stumbled into the diner. The noise of the city no longer felt like a cacophony. It was simply the pulse of life, a rhythm she had learned to move with. She had settled, found a place for herself within it all, and the weight of the past, though still present, had begun to feel more like a distant memory than a suffocating reality. Her decision to take the job at the shelter had been the turning point she hadn't even realized she needed. The work was difficult, demanding in ways she had not expected. There were days when the exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her, when the sorrow in the eyes of the people she served felt like too much to bear. But with every shift, every meal served, she felt a quiet satisfaction settle into her bones. This was where she was meant to be. Her life was no longer about just surviving. It was about building, giving back, and forging connections that mattered. The shelter had become her second home, the people there like an extended family. Laura, the volunteer coordinator, had become more than just a colleague. She was a friend, someone Varen could confide in when the weight of the world seemed too much to carry. One evening, as Varen wiped down the counters in the kitchen, Laura approached her with a thoughtful look on her face. "You've been working here for a while now," Laura began, her voice soft, "and I can see how much you care about the people we help. I wanted to ask you something." Varen looked up from her task, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "What is it?" "I've been thinking," Laura said, her eyes bright with possibility. "There's a position opening up. It's a management role, overseeing the kitchen, meal planning, and coordinating volunteers. You've shown you have the skills and the heart for it. I think you'd be perfect for it." Varen blinked, surprised by the offer. "Management?" she repeated, almost incredulous. Laura smiled. "I know it's a big step, but I believe in you. You've shown that you're not just here for a paycheck. You care about the people we serve. You've got the passion, the drive. It's time to put that to use in a bigger way." Varen felt a mix of emotions. The thought of stepping into a leadership role was daunting. She had never been in charge of anything before, let alone managing the needs of a kitchen full of volunteers and clients. But the idea also excited her. It was an opportunity to make a real difference, to reach even more people who needed help, just as she once had. "I don't know," she said slowly. I've never done anything like this before. Laura's expression softened. Neither had I when I started. But you learn, and you're not alone. I'll be here to guide you every step of the way. Varen felt the weight of Laura's words settle on her chest. She had come so far, and this was the next step in her journey. She couldn't keep hiding behind the comfort of the kitchen, behind the safety of small, manageable tasks. It was time to step up, to show the world, and herself, that she was capable of more than she ever thought possible. I'll do it, Varen said finally, her voice steady, despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. Laura beamed. I knew you would. The transition into her new role wasn't easy. There were times when the responsibility felt overwhelming, when the demands of managing a team of volunteers, handling meal prep, and ensuring the shelter ran smoothly took its toll. But with each challenge, Varen grew. She learned how to delegate, how to listen to her team, and how to balance compassion with authority. The kitchen, once just a place where she worked tirelessly, became her domain. She transformed it into a space of warmth and efficiency, a place where everyone, no matter their background, felt cared for. As her confidence grew, so did her sense of purpose. She no longer felt like an outsider, an alien in a strange world. She was part of something bigger, a vital cog in the machine that kept the shelter running. The people she worked with, from the volunteers to the clients who passed through the doors, became her family. One particularly cold winter's evening, as she prepared a meal for a group of homeless individuals, one of the clients approached. Her. He was a man in his mid-50s, his face weathered by years of hard living. He had been coming to the shelter for months, always quiet, always distant. But tonight, there was something different in his eyes. You've done a lot for us, he said, his voice rough from disuse. Varen paused, wiping her hands on her apron. I'm just doing my job, she said softly. No. The man shook his head, his eyes locking onto hers with a sincerity that made her heart ache. You've done more than that. You've given us something we didn't know we needed. Hope. And for that, well, thank you. Varen felt a lump form in her throat. She had never expected gratitude. She had never asked for it. But hearing those words, seeing the emotion in his eyes, made everything worth it. The long hours, the struggles, the moments of doubt, suddenly they all made sense. Thank you, she whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. That night, as Varen sat in her small apartment, the weight of the day on her shoulders, she couldn't help but think of how far she had come. She had gone from a lonely, desperate woman to someone who had made a real difference in the world. And while there would always be challenges ahead, she knew she was ready for them. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking her thoughts. It was a message from Heron. You free tomorrow night? I thought we could grab dinner together. You've been working so hard lately, you deserve a break. Varen smiled as she typed her response. I'd love that. How about the little Italian place on Main Street? She set the phone down, her fingers lingering on the screen for a moment longer than necessary. The thought of seeing Heron, of spending time with someone who had supported her from the beginning, brought a sense of warmth to her chest. He had been her anchor when everything was uncertain, and now, months later, he was still there. The dinner with Heron was quiet but comfortable, just like the friendship they had built. They shared a bottle of red wine, and Varen laughed as Heron recounted one of his more embarrassing moments at work. For a few hours, the weight of the world lifted, and it was just the two of them, enjoying the simple pleasure of good food and good company. As they finished their meal, Heron leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. I've been thinking about something, he said, his voice serious. Varen raised an eyebrow. What's that? You, he said simply. I've seen the way you've changed, the way you've built something out of nothing. I've never been more impressed by anyone in my life. Varen looked down, a blush creeping up her neck. It's what I had to do. I didn't have a choice. Heron reached across the table, his hand resting gently over hers. But you chose to do it. You chose to help people, to make something of yourself. That's not just survival, Varen. That's strength. Her breath caught in her throat as she met his gaze. For the first time, she saw him not just as a friend, but as someone who truly understood her, someone who saw her for the person she had become. Not the broken alien who had arrived in this world, but the woman who had fought her way through it. I never thought of it like that, she said softly. Heron smiled, his thumb brushing over her hand in a comforting gesture. Well, now you know. You've done more than just survive, Varen. You've thrived. Varen's heart swelled with emotion as she gazed at him. In that moment, she realized something that had eluded her for so long. She was no longer alone. The world, once so alien and distant, had become a place where she could belong, and she had built that, piece by piece, day by day. As they left the restaurant, the crisp night air filled their lungs, and for the first time in a long while, Verene felt at peace. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had brought her to a place of strength, of hope, and of love, and in that moment she knew that whatever came next, she was ready for it.